On to our next session now, An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India. Please welcome on stage Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Professor Gauri Viswanathan.
So it's great to be here with Shashi Tharoor, who truly needs no introduction to most people in this audience. Currently a second-term Lok Sabha MP representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency, he's had a distinguished career in public service, both in the government of India and in the United Nations in New York, which is where I first met him. And at the UN, he served as Under-Secretary General under Kofi Annan's leadership. He has somehow, and I really would like to know how he has done this, but he has somehow always managed to find time in his busy career to write numerous books, among which are the great Indian novel, India from Midnight to the Millennium, and Pax Indica, India and the World, and India Shastra. His latest book is An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India, which is what we will talk about this morning. So Shashi, this is a highly readable, absorbing book, which makes a sustained argument about the deep-seated harm caused by British colonialism in India. The title, Era of Darkness, obviously echoes V.S. Naipaul's Area of Darkness. Did you see yourself writing back to Naipaul's grim depiction of post-colonial India to unpack, as it were, the causes that contributed to making India a wounded civilization, as Naipaul termed it?
Right, and before I answer that, let me just again react to your very generous introduction. Thank you. It's great to see Gauri Viswanathan again. When the Hindu invited her to do this session with me, they didn't know, and Gauri didn't know, that she is herself cited in my book on one aspect of her groundbreaking research that she was working on when I first met her all of 27 years ago, or thereabouts. But coming back to her comment about where do you find the time, the honest truth is you only need to find time if you've lost it in the first place. So if you've held on to tried to squeeze as much as you can out of every minute, and perhaps not sleep enough, then you can manage to do something else. It always comes at the expense of something. Expense sometimes of friendships, of social engagements, of entertainment, of movies. But the fact is that you can create that time. But let me come back to your substantive question. Is this an exercise in writing back? Yes, but in part, because the book actually came out of the speech at Oxford where I had laid out the rudiments of the case against the British Empire in India. And so it started off as just laying out the case, but inevitably, and prodded by my extremely well-read publisher, David Davidar, whose idea the book was, I inevitably found myself reading a lot of the other side of the argument. And there is a surprising amount there. I mean, if you look at people like Neil Ferguson, Lawrence James, a whole host of popularizers from Philip Mason through to Charles Allen Martin, the whole lot of them, there is this very romanticized view of the empire that is inherently self-exculpatory, that basically makes the argument in Ferguson's memorable analysis that the British Empire was, quote unquote, a good thing, capital G, capital T, that had brought into the world all the so-called killer apps of modern civilization, and that the British Empire, in fact, laid the foundations for the globalized modern era in which India has benefited from. And therefore, though his argument is about empire as a whole and not just India, there is this very sort of rose-tinted positive view. And it's, of course, much worse in the writings of popular historians like Lawrence James, who actually claimed that the British Empire was the greatest example of benign altruism in human history, which sort of makes you want to choke. And so, yes, there was a certain desire to refute these kinds of arguments, which I have explicitly quoted in the book. And when it came to the title, yes, to some degree, though Naipaul did not write much about the colonial period, he was guilty of the same historical amnesia as many of these romanticizers or justifiers or apologists today, because he wrote about India devoid of the historical colonial context. And his attack on India and that memorable title of his deserved, I thought, to be echoed in the present one. Amusingly enough, this title is not going to be used in the British edition. The British preferred a different title. So Era of Darkness is just for us folks.
Yeah, that is actually what I did find very intriguing, that you've completely turned that idea of darkness back onto to the British rather than the Indians to whom Naipaul had applied the term.
You know, when Conrad has a line which I quote in the epigraph about darkness was here yesterday, what they meant was, what even Conrad meant, was that the darkness was the darkness of the pre-colonial period. The white man came in and brought light.
Right,
Today, when you say darkness was here yesterday, you are really thinking of the yesterday of the 200 years of British rule.
You mentioned the Oxford lecture, which in a sense precipitated the longer book. In the first part of the book, you discuss the idea of reparations. This actually did come out of the Oxford lecture, but you discuss the question of reparations from the British to recompense Indians for the losses they endured during colonial rule. But you also speak about atonement as what is really desired from the British rather than actual remuneration. Your reference to atonement brought to my mind Edward Thompson's powerful call in his 1926 book, The Other Side of the Medal, in which he made a call for Britain to recognize the harm it had inflicted on the peoples it colonized. Now, of course, we all remember Edward Thompson as a missionary who spent considerable time in India, was a friend of Tagore, though they had a contentious relationship. But it was unusual for someone at that time to make that argument about Britain having to recognize the moral injuries it had committed upon India during this period of colonization. There are obviously religious overtones in Edward Thompson's use of the word atonement. But in your use, there is actually a moral rather than a religious emphasis. And I'm interested to know how you would like to see British atonement expressed if such a gesture is to be more than purely symbolic.
Right. Well, to some degree, you can't avoid the purely symbolic, but let me address all the aspects of that very interesting question. First, on the reparations part, even in the Oxford debate, I did not make much of it. It happened to be the topic the students had assigned to the debate, so one was stuck with having to take it into account. But I said even in the debate that it's difficult to quantify the extraordinary amount of damage done by the British, and that I'd be content with a symbolic £1 a year for 200 years, just to make the point that something was owed to India. But, you know, frankly, when my speech went viral on YouTube and so on, an Indian journalist actually sat down and calculated what would be a fair sum of reparations. And he came up with a figure so astronomical, about £3 trillion sterling, which is equivalent to the entire UK GDP, that it confirmed my argument that that any credible sum of reparations would in fact not be payable. But equally, any payable sum would not be credible. So why go in for this reparations argument? Even my £1 a year, no finance ministry would want to administer it on either side of the equation. So I said, let's move away from a monetary argument into a moral argument. And while Gauri is right, it is moral rather than religious. And I'll open a parenthesis here about her last comment and say that though I haven't read The Other Side of the Medal, Thompson was actually representative of quite a strong streak of disapproval of British colonialism throughout the colonial period. A lot of it was explicitly religious. I've quoted extensively because I read his writings. William Howlett, the preacher, who in the 1830s condemned the East India Company in terms that are absolutely uncompromising and deeply, deeply religious and moral. But equally, Charles Andrews in the 20th century, contemporary of Edward Thompson's, and his association with Gandhiji. So there's a religious element. But then if you go as far back as the House of Commons debates on Warren Hastings' impeachment, you find a secular condemnation of East India Company in rather dramatic words. I've quoted, for example, the speech of Sheridan. I've quoted some things, some of the points made by Burke. These were people who were not particularly religious, but who saw the evils and the wrongs being perpetrated by the company in their rule in India. So I would argue that there is evidence throughout the period, and I've quoted quite a bit of it, that there were Britons who had no illusions about what the East India Company and subsequently the British government were up to. And I even delved into some House of Commons testimonies from the 1850s before the mutiny. Testimonies by administrators, British administrators in India, going back and testifying in the House of Commons. The British actually got more hypocritical and more dishonest about their own motives as the 19th century wore on. But then only the religious ones were left to tell the truth. But still, there was always this current. That's the parenthesis. But coming back to the moral argument, I suggested that atonement could take two forms. One is, very simply, an apology. And there are two very important precedents that I've cited in the book, and many of you can think of others. One is Willy Brandt, the Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, sinking to his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto in 1970 in apology to the Polish Jews in particular and the Polish people in general for the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Now, the interesting thing is that Willy Brandt, being a social democrat, was totally innocent of any taint of the Nazi atrocities himself. In fact, social democrats like him were subject to persecution by the Nazis. And yet, as head of the German government, he felt it was his duty and responsibility to convey that sense of apology. I thought it was a very powerful gesture. And the more recent example from last year is that of the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who apologized to the people of India for the Komagata Maru incident 100 years earlier, in which this Japanese ship, the Komagata Maru, laden with Indians fleeing the British Raj, was turned away from the port of Vancouver. And pretty much everyone on board met a grisly death, either on the high seas or at British hands when they got back. And the fact is that that the Canadians didn't shoot anybody themselves, and Trudeau, again being a liberal, and a century later one could argue he had no obligation to apologize, but he did. And I thought the gesture of a Canadian Prime Minister in Parliament, by the way, apologizing to the Indian people was a magnificent gesture. Now, these two examples suggested to me that if a British figure of consequence, ideally the Prime Minister or a member of the royal family, were to come to one place, and I thought Jallianwala Bagh would be the best example. The centenary of Jallianwala Bagh. The centenary of Jallianwala Bagh is just a couple of years away. It was 1919. It was definitely the single worst atrocity of the Raj. There were many, many atrocities, and I've mentioned a lot from the Vellore massacre to the 1858 reprisals. But the Jallianwala Bagh, everything about it epitomized the worst of the Raj. The brutal killing of unarmed and frankly, not just unarmed civilians, but men, women, and children. There were a lot of children killed. The absolutely ruthless manner in which Daya carried out his, he had proclaimed a ban on public assembly, but these people had come for Baisakhi and had not heard of the ban. So they were not even actually guilty of an infringement when he shot them. The manner in which he did it, assembling his troops near the gate, which was the only exit from the Bagh, so that he would have easier targets. Practically no bullet failed to find a target. The racism and brutality that followed, when for 24 hours he would not let anybody enter to tend to either the dead, the dying, or the wounded. They were lying there moaning without even water for 24 hours. Then his rule that every Indian would have to crawl on their bellies on a street outside, and that if they so much as raised their heads while crawling, they would be hit on the head by British staves. I mean, lathis. Example after example like this. And then after all that, the British actually raise a collection for him and reward him handsomely to the tune of today's money, £250,000 sterling, for his act of massacring Indians. And Rudyard Kipling, that flatulent voice of imperialism, called him the man who saved India. So it was not just the brutality and the racism and the cruelty of Dyer and the British that epitomized what was wrong with the Raj. It was the subsequent behavior, the gratuitous viciousness, the racism of the regulations, and then the justification and support for him by the people of Britain that made this a collective sin and not just a one-off. And therefore, there could be no better place for an apology than then in 2019. I hope they do that.
Such an apology would ever happen?
No. And I think it won't happen. I think the demand is worth making. It can't be made by the government of India, but people like you and me can do so. And I would argue that it won't happen because, as a very senior Brit who told me this in a private conversation, so I can't name him, said to me, if we apologize in one country, we'd have to apologize in 130 different places, and we're not going to do so.
That actually does raise...
Sorry, but Gauri, if I may just add to that one more thought about atonement. The other thing they could easily do is to just teach colonial history in their schools. That would be a form of atonement too. The week my book came out in India, there was an article completely coincidental in The Guardian by a Pakistani journalist whom I don't know personally, Moni Mohsin, talking about how she'd raised 2 children in the best public school, which, as you know, is a private school in London, Westminster, and how her daughters had studied history, had majored in history, but had never learned a line of colonial history. There's this very convenient historical amnesia of brushing things around the carpet. Yes, London has all these wonderful colonial era buildings and monuments. What paid to build them is not mentioned. And this is ultimately something that they could do. In fact, after my Oxford speech, somebody asked the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, and he did say, yes, we should start teaching the truth in our schools, but I don't think they'll do that either.
Isn't it Salman Rushdie who said British history is what always happens outside Britain? So that really speaks to that issue of excising colonial history from schools. But that also, I think, does raise this point that you make at several points in your book about this new Raj revival in British popular culture, this nostalgia for the Raj, that horrible series, Indian Summer, which seems to be going on forever. But it's in the tradition of Jewel in the Crown and Far Pavilion. So in my view, it actually echoes a lot of the deep cynicism of George Orwell's Burmese days, just in the kind of the crude depiction of the governing classes. But I wanted to ask you what your take is on this persistent nostalgia. Do you see it as a reflection, in fact, of Britain's current weakness as a global power, so that the weaker Britain becomes, the more it turns towards this past history? Absolutely.
Actually, it's a very interesting observation which had not occurred to me, and I haven't said it in the book. But yes, I think as sort of the tawdry contemporary reality sinks into people's consciousness, I think you're right that the past, the allure of the past somehow grows correspondingly in people's minds. I do cite a Gallup poll in Britain in which a startling percentage of people, I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but something like 39% say they'd love to have the empire again, which is, and 54% I think said it was a good thing and so on. I mean, there is really a hearkening for the lost greatness, and I think you're quite right. I haven't made much of it, but it isn't coming back, as they should probably realize. But it was a very good thing, well, from their point of view, while it lasted, because they came in for the money, let's be very honest. The East India Company was in it for the money, and they made it and stole it and taxed it and expropriated it and sent it back home in spades for the following 200 years. And that's essentially what the colonial enterprise was fundamentally all about. All the sort of ex post facto justifications after the 1857 revolt, which talked about, governing for the benefit of the Indians and so on, was utter cant, as documents that have since emerged, ranging from Lord Lytton's reports back to Britain, right up to a British Home Secretary I've quoted from the 1920s, show that Behind closed doors, the British had no illusions about why they were in India and what they were doing there. And the rest, all of the stuff that was said outside, was purely for external consumption. We shouldn't believe their propaganda. You know, that's a mistake only the current government in India is making.
Well, let's not forget, let's not forget Elihu Yale, who made his fortune here in Madras as formerly the East India Company, and then governor of Madras Presidency, and then giving all that money to what was then Yale College, which is where your two sons went.
I took them to visit the grave of Elihu Yale, actually.
Well, it's right here.
Right here. I took them to in Fort St. George. And what was interesting too was that what he gave wasn't actually all that much. I think it was one shipload of cotton.
By the standards of those times,
perhaps
it was
yeah.
a huge amount. So
anyway, he got an immortal name as a result of it.
Right. So you mentioned Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, and I want to come to this in a bit. But just to recap, I mean, your book makes, well, it demolishes a number of time-honored myths about British colonialism, which have, of course, been perpetuated in the work of historians like Neil Ferguson, as you've mentioned. And just to recap, the first one is that Britain gave India its political unity, and second, that Britain gave India its democratic and pluralist character, and third, that Britain modernized India, from all of which we can conclude that British rule was benign. And you take each of these points and you dismantle the foundational premises. I want to go back to a very highly charged exchange in the 1980s that took place between two well-known critics, Conor Cruise O'Brien and Edward Said. And the topic of their discussion was comparative colonialisms. Now, Conor Cruise O'Brien said no matter how bad British colonialism was, Belgian colonialism was far worse. And in arguing his case, O'Brien asserted the points about Britain's democratic principles that you have critiqued in your book. So I'm curious to hear your perspective about colonialisms considered in a comparative framework. Was indeed British colonialism less bad than other European colonialisms, Belgian, French, and if you look at the literatures that Heart of Darkness, and this question becomes, I think, quite critical. Or perhaps, on the other hand, it doesn't matter at all. So if we put British colonialism within the context of European colonialisms, how might that change your argument, if at all, or if not?
Well, it wouldn't change the argument, but it depends on what categories you want to, the prism through which you examine all this. The Belgians were undoubtedly worse because they were absolutely murderous, rapacious. I mean, they were, in many ways, sort of the East India Company writ large 100 years later kind of thing. Terrible, terrible. And the Congo suffered grotesquely under Belgian rule. So one doesn't want to expiate any of these colonialisms. But if, for example, you look at the French approach, the assimilationism of the French, I find it quite striking that, and I've, not read nearly as much about all these other colonialisms as I have about the British, but it's very striking that you would find little French children, I beg your pardon, you'll find little Vietnamese children or Senegalese children dutifully reciting in school, Nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors the Gauls, because they were taught to internalize the myth that they were part of the great French nation. And I have read accounts, contemporary accounts in the 30s and 40s, by journalists meeting sort of large black Africans who, when asked where they were from, would stand up and say very proudly, Moi, je suis français, I'm French. Whereas no Indian, right up to 1947, even if he was living in England, could say, I am British. They were simply not entitled to. They were subjects in Niraj Chaudhry's unwitting formulation. They were subjects, never citizens. And that sort of, so if you think, for example, that assimilation, cultural assimilation is a virtue because it is more benign than blatant racism and separation and de facto apartheid, then clearly the French system would seem to be superior. Now, though obviously you can talk to many people who had been colonized by the French, or at least their descendants, and they'll tell you that being run by foreigners is just as bad, whether it's French or Indian. But certainly, I think they went much farther in cultural assimilation than the British ever intended to or wanted to. Then if you look at things like intermarriage, the Portuguese were no less cruel when it came to the ruthless enforcement of their rule, but they had absolutely no prohibition on racial mixing. And so the Portuguese routinely married into colored families, whether it was in Africa or in India, and vice versa. And an entire mestizo community grew up in Portuguese colonies, one of the interesting results of which is today the Prime Minister of Portugal is of Goan descent, and is visibly so. He looks more Indian than he looks European. So the fact is that, again, if that's a virtue, then you contrast that with the relegation of the Anglo-Indian community, which really they were a very, very tiny minority because there's only the British other ranks after about the 1820s, 1830s, when the fishing fleet of white women started coming to India. No longer were any of the officers allowed to, expected to, or encouraged to take Indian wives. Whereas, say, from about 1750 to about 1820, it was a common practice, relatively speaking. Thereafter, it wasn't, and the racism was very deeply entrenched. By comparison with, as I said, what happened, say, in the Portuguese colonies. So it depends on which angle you want to look at. All colonialisms were bad. All of them were cruel, extractive, were focused on their own benefit, were focused on their own profit. But having done all of that, the fact is that in each of these specific categories, there were ways in which one was better than another.
I think it's an interesting point about assimilation, the forcible assimilation, perhaps in the French context, whereas in the Indian context, and this really goes back to the Orientalist policy that was adopted, the promotion of Indian languages. This is, we're talking about before Macaulay. So that, William Jones, Hallhead, the kinds of translations that were promoted, that were encouraged, would seem to suggest that there wasn't this attempt to assimilate, to erase languages. So I think at one level, as you say, I agree with you that it really depends on the framework that one is using, whether one is talking about, ideas of cultural representation, the exercise of cultural power, or whether, in fact, political power is exercised to the extent that the expression of individual sentiment is completely suppressed. The question that I'm sort of moving towards, it actually connects a little even further into the post-colonial context. Because one very important strand of your argument is that the syncretism of the pre-colonial period was displaced by systems of classification that fixed identity and created divisions under British rule that may not have existed earlier. In other words, a new hierarchical logic was introduced into the colonial administration of India, which depended on instruments of collecting data about the population, such as the census and ethnographic surveys, which you talk about at length in your book. I was interested to hear more from you about how the project of fixing identity in colonial India might have translated into similar projects in post-colonial India, and how you would distinguish the contemporary collection of data for identity purposes from the colonial project. I realize I'm touching on a very sensitive topic, but it does strike me as quite inevitable in reading your book to ask this question about, is there some kind of carryover of that project under the colonial era of collecting data about populations to the contemporary moment?
Well, there inevitably is, but as you know, Gauri, I mean, one of the things about colonialism is they colonize the mind as well. And while I argue in the book on the basis of other people's scholarship and very thoroughly documented and footnoted scholarship, that a lot of what the British did to categorize, classify, describe, promote identification of various groups in Indian society was intended to perpetuate their control over Indian society. The result was that people began to identify themselves along these categories. There's been a lot of very good work that has demonstrated, for example, that while we may have had castes before the British came, we didn't have a caste system in the way in which the British essentially concocted it and imposed it upon us. That the whole Chaturvarna concept never existed throughout India as the British pretended it did. That Hastings' original decision to get a bunch of Brahmin Pandits, a dozen of them, to sit down and write what was called the Code of Gentoo Laws, which then laid out what was supposed to be correct orthodox Hinduism, whereas in fact, arguably, a lot of these were just what these chaps wanted it to be, but that the practice had long diverged from the theory. I mean, Manusmriti had been written, whatever it was, 2,000 years earlier, but everyone did not live along the codes of the Manusmriti. There's no evidence that they did. In fact, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. But the Brahmins essentially codified all this, and the British decided that if you are Hindu, this is what you shall be, this is the system you shall follow. Caste, similarly. Caste was a much more fuzzy concept, and there was a lot of interchangeability, including there was geography. In other words, a Shudra could up sticks from one particular princely domain and move to another, start a different profession and lose his caste. Entire caste could move up. The Kayas in northern India was a subcaste that were Shudra in origin, but having learned Persian and become scribes to the rulers, they rose up the totem pole and became very powerful, influential sort of caste as Kayas right across northern India, in fact, which continued on to the British Raj because they switched from Persian to English and all became amongst the first to get into the civil service and the diplomatic corps and so on. So in other words, caste was not an immutable identity, it was very fuzzy. A term which actually is a respectable academic term used by many scholars. So all of that happened, but the British did manage to get us thinking along these lines. For example, an American scholar has demonstrated how there had been no Shia-Sunni division in Lucknow before the British came. Right up to Wajid Ali Shah of chess players, Shatranj ki Khiladi fame, the Muharram commemoration every year in Lucknow was jointly conducted by the Shias, the Sunnis, and the Hindus. But the British came and said, no, this is a Shia thing, only the Shias will be in charge. And within a very short while, of course, the Sunnis started carping at it, and the Shias started abusing the Sunnis. And the first examples of Shia-Sunni violence in Lucknow around Muharram started only because of the British trying to create these silos of identity. So it goes right across the country. But we've internalized this. I mean, the use of caste as an instrument of political mobilization since independence would have horrified Nehru and many of the nationalists who saw through the British designs of imposing these categories on Indians. He really wanted to elide all these categories of caste, religion, region, language, and so on, and create a truly pan-Indian identity. But today, democratic politics has transformed each of these identities into vehicles of political mobilization, of vote getting, of vote claiming. And as a result, what you end up with? You end up with the kind of benefits that are linked explicitly to caste, which then give you a vested interest in preserving caste notions, that in turn give you, for example, as Gauri was implying, the recent decision to have a caste census. The census was held, but the results have never been revealed. No doubt because the political consequences of those results are something that no government wants to be able to swallow. But yet, if you're giving benefits on the basis of caste, there's an argument that you need to know what the numbers are that you are actually reflecting. So all of these things are profoundly important and troubling, and they can be traced directly to the British period.
If we are engaged in conversation today, I'm talking about today in a generalized sense, to combat some of the negative consequences of British colonialism, should we not be in the position to step back at this point, to ask about the practices that we can now recognize as coming out of this impulse perhaps to categorize, to separate, to club together under various groups. So I think I'm still struggling with why, if we can recognize that, we still continue to persist in that direction. It's not just about caste, it's also about, have we just shifted from rule by census gathering to rule by biometrics? The instrument may be different, but perhaps the end game is the same. So it's really that curious continuity of what we recognize as a practice that has resulted in divisions that we continue to to sort of dig our heels into. So there is that, I think, this conundrum that what we recognize is not necessarily what we seek to change. And perhaps, I just have one, this is really coming from that last point, about the post-colonial challenges, about how to critique colonial history without succumbing to a similar critique of post-colonial malfeasance. Because there is, of course, if we're talking about Raj nostalgia, are we also possibly in the predicament of slipping into nostalgia for a pre-British colonial period, and therefore erasing? The earlier session talked about erasure and the forgetting and remembering. Are we, in our effort to acknowledge the the negative effects of British colonialism, not willing to take upon ourselves the task of recognizing those very negatives that, even to articulate, should not invite the charge that we are simply being colonialist or very assimilationist in our thinking? So it's really this refusal of nostalgia for a post-colonial era that I'm asking you.
See, I actually don't object to nostalgia unless it's misused for political purposes. So in other words, all of us, look, as individuals, we tend to want to hear about our childhoods or about our parents or about our grandparents. I believe societies don't become unhealthy by simply being more conscious of their pasts, whether it's a distant past or a more recent one. In fact, I've often argued to young people who say, well, this is all 70 years ago that they left, how does it matter anymore? And my answer tends to be, well, listen, the fact is that if you don't know where you've come from, how on earth will you appreciate where you're going? And the fact is that degree of consciousness about the past is, I believe, healthy. All contemporary life is striking a balance between memory and forgetting. Even the process of nation building, as Ernest Renan said in France in 1882 in his celebrated lecture, he said France could not have been created as a modern state unless people had been willing to forget many of the atrocities that melded those days disparate peoples into one nation. And if you keep harboring the grudges of the injustices that brought you to this state, then you'll never be able to move forward. So all of these things I'm conscious of. It's when we start reinventing the past to serve a political agenda in the present that I'm troubled. I'm much more, if you like, a votary of history as an end in itself. For example, I don't say that because of all the things the British did, that somehow we should have a different attitude to them today. Today we are, our relationship with Britain today is that of two sovereign equals. As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter. One does not infect the other. Today's relationship will be on today's terms. But we understand. We've embraced the past for itself and in its own place. And that's fine. We don't today say to the British, well, you have to give in to this that we're asking for because 200 years ago you did that. That would be silly. And to my mind, history has its own place and it's important to be aware of, but it's history. When you find people, however, trying to reinvent the past to take revenge upon it, which is what the Ram Janmabhoomi movement was all about, for example, then you have a problem. And contemporary society has a problem. And contemporary inheritors of the past are expected to bear the burdens for wrongs either done or allegedly done by their forebears for which they are not in any way responsible. So I'm sorry if I've given you such a theoretical sounding answer, but my answer really is that yes, let's study the past, let's embrace the past, let's value the past, and keep it in the past.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions.
I have a contrary data. You said the caste system was not manifested during the British time, but 1878, the erstwhile collector of Chengalpat, British collector, his name is Truman here, he has written a 100-page report to the erstwhile Board of Revenue requesting land for the pariahs. The report is called the Conditions of Pariah in Chengalpat district. And this is corroborated by another historian called Ayodhidasa Pandidar, who had also written about the condition of the Dalits in those days. So caste has already manifested, deep-rooted and practiced throughout, I think, Tamil Nadu, and because we have all the evidences. So what you say, I think, may not be true in the case of Tamil Nadu at least.
Shivakami, that's a very important point. I'm glad you gave me a chance to talk about it. The oppression of the Dalits is a historical fact throughout India and went on for perhaps 3,000 years. But my argument is you don't need to go to the expense of being colonized and the trouble and horrors of being colonized in order to reform your own society. I would argue, for example, that whereas someone like Mahatma Phule was very much a product of a British education, and to some degree Dr. Ambedkar as well, and they were the ones we think of, particularly in northern India, as having given voice to the injustices being suffered by the Dalits, and therefore we argue that thanks to the British, the Dalits were able to overcome their oppression. I can turn to the very part of India that I now represent in Parliament, Travancore, and talk to you about Mahatma Ayankali, who did not have a British education, but who, as a Dalit, fought for the rights of Dalits before Phule and Ambedkar, and did so in a completely Indian idiom. So just as he could do it in Travancore in a non-British princely state, so too, it seems to me, we would have generated reformers without a British collector having to come and point out the injustices. Just as you can see, for example, widow remarriage in Bengal, which is often credited to the British, was really Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar who did it, by setting the extraordinary example as an unmarried young man of marrying a widow himself. Sati, yes, we give the British the credit because Bentinck abolished Sati, but it was actually Raja Ram Mohan Roy who led the campaign for the abolition of Sati. You needed a British ruler. Because the British were ruling, you needed a ruler who's prepared to approve it. But who says that an Indian ruler would not have? Look at the oppression of women, for example, and then look at the fact that we will be celebrating this year the double centenary of the very first ruler in human history anywhere in the world to legislate and make free and compulsory primary school education for boys and girls. And that was not in America or England or France, it was in Travancore, Rani Gauri Parvati Bai. So, you know, we were capable of reforming ourselves. History ensured that the British were in power when some of these reforms came. But it could have been other rulers, enlightened Indian thinkers as well.
Sit. Shall I ask you one question, sir?
Whoever has the mic, go ahead.
Yeah.
First, hello, if what you say is true, why are 1.45 million Indians live in UK? And also point number 2 is, the British followed the same policy in Australia, Canada and Hong Kong. They could not damage it. Point number 3 is, whatever you say about some you call romanticizers of the British rule, Ralph Waldo Emerson was not a romanticizer of British rule, but he has written a book, English Traits, which says totally against what you have said in your book.
Okay, well first, on the Indians living in Britain, the answer was best provided by an immigrant during a demonstration in London who held up a placard saying, "We are here because you were there." I mean, that is the absolute reality. They are tasting the fruits of their 200 years of colonial conquest. Secondly, when it comes to Australia, Canada, for you to say the British did no damage to those societies, have you thought about the inhabitants of those societies before the British people and the white people came? The Aboriginals who got wiped out, confined to reservations in both Australia and Canada, reduced. please read. I mean, there's very little because the Aboriginals did not get much of an education till recently. Very little there. Canada has a powerful memoirs of Michael Doris. Read about what the life of despair, isolation, alcoholism, that even 200 years afterwards, the original inhabitants of those two countries are suffering as a result of the advent of colonial rule. The fact is that each country's experience is different. With India, one fact is inescapable. The British came to one of the richest countries in the world with 23% of global GDP, and in 200 years of exploitation and loot, they reduced it to one of the poorest countries in the world. 90% of the population below the poverty line, appalling rate of life expectancy, and down to below 3% of global GDP. I rest my case.
Sir, what are your views on the fact many of the laws enacted during the British rule, especially on the personal codes and laws, are still continuing and giving us an impact even as a democracy?
I have actually addressed this very issue in the section on rule of law in my book, so please read it. I deplore very much the imposition on Indian culture of the Victorian moral and criminal code, drafted, by the way, in 1837 by Macaulay, sitting behind high walls, not had any contact with the actual practices of Indian jurisprudence. Enacted 24 years later by the British in 1861 and still carried on today. Fortunately, last year, President Pranab Mukherjee finally called, as I have been calling in Parliament for some time, he called for a complete review of the Indian Penal Code. It may be too late, again, because we've internalized a lot of the habits and practices. But I have gone into some detail, everything from Section 3.7 to the laws on women, to adultery, to sedition. All of these are completely British Victorian values thrust down our unwilling throats that we have since internalized and are living by.
Good morning, Mr. Tharoor. Yeah, firstly, congratulations for ripping colonial hegemony to shreds.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well,
for
do
being
read the
us
full
here.
book because we've only touched on aspects of it.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to correlate two aspects of your discussion. The first part, you really appreciated Justin Trudeau and the German head of government apologizing for whatever their predecessors had done. And then while concluding your discussion, you got to a point where let the past be in the past. Don't they actually go against each other? Could you just...
What I mean is that, for example, in the case of Canada, whether Mr. Trudeau had apologized or not, it would not affect and should not affect India's relationship with Canada today. That's what I meant. But certainly, as far as I'm concerned, the apology was a very fine gesture. And it will make us as individuals think all the better of him and the government over which he presides. But it will not affect, for example, our trade relationship or our political relationship or whatever. It may make us well disposed towards them, and that's fine. But it was actually a worthy thing to do for its own sake, in its own right, and in its own place. That's my point.
I believe
Sir,
we're asked to
when
conclude.
will you write a book on amorous adventures?
I haven't understood the question. Did you?
I believe they...
Your amorous adventures.
Can somebody close to the mic just repeat it so I can catch it?
wanted to
Maybe
ask, like, when will you next write a book upon your adventures that you're...
my own adventures.
Yes.
I don't think it would be as gripping as the British adventures in India or misadventures. One day we'll see, but not yet.
Hello?
So,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What about the scholarship which the British gave us? I mean, from say, William Jones to so many historians. It did give us a superficial sense of oneness. I mean, the oneness was probably there, I don't know, but it did give us. That's one. And the other thing is, Chatur Varna definitely existed far before. It was established. And it existed. As a student of history, ancient Indian history, I can tell you that. It's not the English who sort of course, they made it a little more hierarchical. In the sense that the Brahmins
and a
come
little more
first.
universal.
But it goes back to Purusha Sukta in the Rig Veda. I mean, it began then, and Chaturvarna was absolutely.
This is a long question and I'm conscious we're out of time. First, on the scholarship. There was a lot of it. much of it, one would argue most of it, was motivated scholarship. Jones, actually, I admire. I think he was a bit of an exception. And he was actually healthily cynical about some of the scholarship that his own government was paying for. For example, on the Code of Gentoo laws and the reification of the Chaturvarna system and so on, he said, I think these Brahmins are busy making up laws as it suits them, and if they can't find it in the scriptures, they will invent it for ready money. But Jones died young, and his cynicism did not survive. But the truth is, I mean, if you take Chaturvarna, for example, it didn't exist in many parts of the country, not quite that form. I mean, if you just take my own community of the Nayars in Kerala, where would you fit them into the system? They were a warrior community. They were matrilineal. They were, in many ways, sort of immigrants into that part of southern India. Complicated. I mean, the subcastes alone was such a bewilderingly dizzy array, and then you've got Srinivas's work on Sanskritization. So let's not see it the way the British did, because the British did it for purposes of classification, categorization, and control. But the scholarship was impressive in all ways except one. Despite being motivated, there was a lot of good stuff that came out, and certainly many Indians might not have been conscious of some of the jewels of our own past had it not been for revival and translation into English, though what use the translation was put to is another area of dispute and discussion. But when you say it gave us a sense of our unity, did you say that? I heard you say that. That is simply not at all accurate, because well before the British, first of all, you've got the Vedic reference to Bharatvarsha as the land between the Himalayas and the oceans. Then you've got Adi Shankara coming from my part of India, going all the way up to Kashmir and establishing his mat, going all the way to Dwarka in the west, to Puri in the east. That sense of a civilizational space, which, as the Harvard scholar Diana Eck describes it, the sacred geography of India, established by timeless tracks of pilgrimage, that sense of civilizational unity. I mean, why does somebody sitting in Kerala dream of dying in Kashi? I mean, or taking their ashes to Kashi, or whatever. There is very much a sense of a civilizational oneness right throughout time. And let me stress, it's not only Hindu, because Maulana Azad has written about how Muslims going on the Hajj, whether they were Tamils or Pathans, were all treated by the Arabs as Hindi. Okay, they were seen as emanating from one common, recognizable civilizational unit. Now that is a legacy of 2,000 or 3,000 years, way before the British came in the 1750s. So there's a lot more to be said. I would urge you to read An Era of Darkness, because pretty much all the issues that's come up here have been addressed in the book, and possibly in a little more convincing detail than I could muster in a short conversation. Thank you, Gauri, for your question.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor and Professor Viswanathan, for that very interesting perspective. Dr. Tharoor will now be available for book signings outside the auditorium.